Okay, it looks like our participants are trickling in slowly. I don't know what the situation is like for you where you are, but we in the UK are in the grips of a very rare and unseasonal heat wave. So we realize on a hot July afternoon, we have a lot to compete with. So thank you so much for joining us today. We will make a slow start and hope that others trickle in as we are getting going. So welcome to today's panel, Progress Not Pledges. What are the practical steps to universal internet? My name's Sophie Tholstrup. I'm the head of Tech for Development Policy at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And it's my very great honor to be co-hosting today's event with Mark Buell, the Regional Vice President for North America for the Internet Society. So Mark is going to be jumping in a minute or two to tell you more about his work and how the Internet Society has been approaching this critical question of universal internet access. And I'll be presenting briefly some of the key findings from our recent report on what's needed to achieve universal internet by 2030. But before we do that, I want to introduce the stars of the show today, bringing together some of the biggest thinkers on universal internet access from the worlds of tech, academia, and the development system, today's panelists. So we're joined today by Monica Desai from Facebook, Yolanda Ma from the UN Development Programme, and Dr. Traci Morris from the American Indian Policy Institute. And as we mentioned in the pre-chat, and if my esteemed co-host will allow me, it's a real pleasure to be introducing an all-female panel on a tech policy debate. That doesn't happen all the time, so particularly grateful to be joined by this all-star cast today. Monica Desai is the global head of the Connectivity and Access Policy Group at Facebook, where she focuses on issues involving infrastructure, broadband deployment, spectrum, accessibility, online communication service providers, and net neutrality. And Yolanda Ma is the head of digital policy and global partnerships at UNDP, based in New York. She leads a team that provides advisory support to countries on digital for development issues, ranging from national digital strategy development to digital solutions, such as COVID-19 tracking dashboards and digital payment systems. Yolanda also manages global partnerships across sectors to build a digital ecosystem that is aligned on an inclusive and sustainable vision. And last but by no means least, Dr. Traci Morris is the Executive Director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University and is a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. Under her leadership, AIPI has grown and diversified its service to Indian country, providing policy analysis, tribally driven research, and economic development capacity building. Morris's research and publications on Native American media and the digital divide is focused on internet use, digital inclusion, network neutrality, digital and new media curriculums, and development of broadband networks in Indian country. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. As the title of the panel suggests, what we're hoping to do is to dig in and get really concrete about the steps needed to achieve universal internet access by 2030. And as you can see, we have the right people for the job, and we're approaching this through a number of lenses, through the lens of a big tech company, the multilateral development system, and from the lens of academia and public policy. So we've got the right group of brains to really crack this problem. And to those of you joining in the audience today, which I see is slowly growing, that's excellent news. Thank you. As I mentioned, for many of you who are joining, you will be making the choice between enjoying some beautiful, balmy evening sun on a July afternoon and joining this panel on universal internet access. So we are incredibly grateful that you've made this choice. Thank you. As our panelists present, feel free to drop any burning questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure that we leave time at the end to get to those and put your tough questions to the panelists. If it's for a particular member of the panel, please do let us know who the question is for, and I'll make sure that we get time at the end to do that. And no multitasking is allowed. We've very meanly dropped in a couple of polling questions along the way, so please do leave emails in the background, give us your full undivided attention for the next hour, and we'll be surprising you with polling questions. So before we unleash our all-star panel, I wanted to set the scene by sharing just a few quick highlights from an excellent report that we published back in March, The Progressive Case for Universal Internet Access. how to close the digital divide by 2030. And I am allowed to say unequivocally that it's an excellent report because it was published just before I arrived at the Institute by my colleagues Roxanne Bamford, Georgina Hutchinson, and Ben Macon-Cooney, some of whom are on the call. So kudos to them for a great report. Rereading this report with fresh eyes, what stands out to me is this. Not only is universal internet access by 2030 achievable, but all the pieces needed to get there are already in place. Getting there is just a question of tweaking the incentives, getting the necessary political energy behind it, and getting universal internet access to the top of national, regional, and global policy agendas. The tech revolution, as all of you on this call will need no convincing, is changing lives, societies, and economies at astonishing speed. It's unlocking access to markets, jobs, information, education, and services, and changing the landscape of prosperity and opportunity. But with nearly half the world, 3.7 billion people still offline, we risk a widening divide, entrenching and increasing inequalities as more aspects of our lives go digital. And we'll hope to pull out some examples of what that risk looks like in real life through this panel. Ensuring universal internet access is fundamental to building a prosperous and inclusive global society for generations to come. And the report, as I read it, tells us three key things. Firstly, the economic case is crystal clear. Secondly, the political case for universal internet access is compelling. This is a win for everyone. And thirdly, the tech we need to connect the world exists, and the majority of the investment needed in building out infrastructure will come from the private sector if we get the incentives right. So to expand on those very briefly, the economic case is a no-brainer. We estimate that achieving universal internet access by 2030 will cost $450 billion. And that's certainly a significant investment, in particular as the world reels from COVID and in some parts of the world, COVID recovery. But to put it in perspective, that is less than we lose to global GDP every year because of the existence of tax havens. And it's only 3% of the amount of money that the world's richest countries have pledged to spend every year on international development spending. So 3% of international development spending. And the report also estimates that the value generated for lower and middle income countries alone will be $8.7 trillion. How many development programs in the world can boast a 19x return on investment? In a time when global development resources are so constrained, it's more important than ever to ensure we're maximizing the return on every aid dollar. And universal internet access absolutely does that, transforming opportunity, access, and information for generations to come. So the economic case, as far as we can see, is an absolute no-brainer. This is a clear winner when it comes to investment from both governments themselves and from the international development system. And Yolanda, looking forward to hearing more about how you see that from your perspective later on. Second, the political case is compelling and it's easy to make. A better connected world benefits everyone. I'm just going to pick out a few statistics here without wanting to bombard you too much, but do dig into the report because I think it makes this case more clearly than I've seen anywhere else. So I wanted to flag a couple of those stats. Universal internet access brings opportunity. If we increased internet penetration to 75% in lower and middle income countries, we would create 140 million jobs. And it brings prosperity. For every 10% increase in mobile broadband penetration in sub-Saharan Africa, we see a 2% increase in GDP. And that's massive. It raises living standards. As we all know, increased connectivity has applications across improving healthcare, accessing high quality education, and making agriculture more productive and resilient. And closing the digital divide, which I think is why we're all here today, promotes equity. This really is a turning point in human history where we can either level the playing field or see an increasing digital divide. And just one example of that, the World Bank estimates that through education lost through the pandemic, we're going to see a $10 trillion loss in future earnings. And the brunt of that will be borne by people that were not able to access remote education opportunities through the pandemic. So lack of connectivity has cost those on the wrong side of the digital divide $10 trillion of future earning loss. And that, for me, is entirely unacceptable given the case that we're looking at. And finally, universal internet access promotes free, open, and prosperous societies. think we all know building an open and inclusive internet infrastructure that is premised on human dignity, liberty, and freedom enables all people to forge their own opportunities to learn, innovate, and thrive. And what's really hopeful here is that we're seeing, for example, the Biden administration and the Italian presidency of the G20 recognizing all of that and pushing universal internet access to the top of their agendas. This feels like a ripe political moment. And again, Yolanda will be leaning on you to tell us more about that during the panel. And finally, the tech that we need to connect the world exists. We're no longer struggling with ideas for how to conceive of last mile delivery. With clear incentives to connect the world, big tech players are coalescing around this critical challenge of connecting the world. And we're seeing a number of really promising initiatives coming from the private sector. And the report estimates that 75% of the investment we need to build out infrastructure for universal internet access will come from the private sector themselves, as long as we get the incentives right. So all the three big pieces, the funding, the political will, and the technology are in place. That all the arguments are made, all the pieces we need are in place. The critical question for us now, as how I see it, is to bring these pieces together, to make the investment case, to energize political leadership and stimulate demand. And the report, which I would urge you all to dive into because we've just scratched the surface here, sets out three clear next steps. First of all, create a focused program to stimulate the demand for 4G and equivalent services to make more infrastructure investments viable. So make it possible for the private sector to build out infrastructure. Secondly, we need bold measures to open up markets and drive down prices for consumers. And that will take some creativity for governments and regional bodies around regulatory and policy reforms. And thirdly, increased and focused global coordination to diversify and expand broadband investment vehicles globally. So the report is incredibly rich. Please do give it a read. But I should say that we're, of course, not alone in thinking through this massive global challenge, and everyone on the call today will have their own views about the next steps we should be prioritizing. So looking forward to hearing some challenge through the panel. Mark, I'm going to turn to you now to hear more about how you and the Internet Society have been thinking through this and what you see as the key priorities. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. And thank you to the TBI team for putting together an excellent and very timely report. I'd like to echo Sophie's comment, urging you to read the report if you haven't. It's very good. So for nearly 30 years, the Internet Society has been home to a global community of people dedicated to bringing the internet to everyone. We work with the communities that are among the most difficult in the world to connect. These are communities where a market-based solution like a traditional internet service provider deploying infrastructure has not worked. So we help with community-driven solutions like municipal or community networks. We work with partners around the world to develop community-driven connectivity solutions and to catalyze communities. Partners like governments, the private sector, universities, organizations like the Tony Blair Institute, essentially anyone that believes that the internet is for everyone. We do this because while the internet revolution has come to much of the world, there are places that have been left behind. And some of those places are in North America. A lot of what I'll refer to is based in North America because that's a perspective I come from. Yes, it's true that Canada and the US enjoy some of the highest rates of internet access in the world, but that access is not distributed equitably. Here's a reality check. We actually don't even know the extent of the digital divide in Canada and the United States. The methods that we use to map broadband, especially in the US, are woefully inadequate at best and highly inaccurate at worst. But we do know one thing, that a significant digital divide in Canada and the US persists, especially in rural and remote areas. And as a result, Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by that divide. From isolated communities in the Arctic to Native Hawaiian communities on the islands and everywhere in between, Indigenous communities are being left behind. All too often, those areas are the places that could benefit the most from access. As TBI's report says, the digital divide is already magnifying existing inequalities, and this will intensify as more elements of our work and public and private lives are facilitated by digital technologies. This is true around the world, and it's certainly true in North America as well. To address this divide, we continue to work with our Indigenous partners to deliver training, convene stakeholders, advocate for policies that would facilitate community-driven connectivity solutions, and support communities to deploy their own networks. As Sophie said, right now we're really faced with a once-in-a-generation opportunity. COVID-19 has shown the world just how important the internet is during a crisis. And as we begin to build back our economies, unprecedented amounts of money are being committed to expand access. Sophie had mentioned the US, anywhere between 60 and $100 billion is currently on the table to expand access in the country. We just need to make sure we do that right. And I hope that's really what we get to today in our discussion. You know, to me, that means rethinking of how we fund access initiatives and bringing the right stakeholders to the table when we design new programs. I think I'll stop there, but I do look forward to today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Mark, and very much appreciated that you've kept it brief. It'll help us to speed through and leave maximum time for Q&A. Thank you. So I cross my fingers that the technology works. We're now going to turn to you in the audience and take your temperature to understand what you see as the biggest challenge to connecting the world as. And we've only given you 3 options. We should probably have included an other, but of the following 3 options, we would just want to hear from you. Where do you think the biggest barriers lie? So you should all be seeing a poll pop up. Oh, this is pretty unequivocal so far. I'll give you a couple more minutes. Interesting. I see some none of the aboves in the chat. Looking forward to hearing more about that in the Q&A session. Please do, if you have specific questions on that or specific ideas, please drop them in the chat. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm gonna share the results. Oh yeah, I have shared the results. And you can see it's pretty unequivocal. We feel that the resources are the least of our worries. The resources are there. The tech and the infrastructure is a challenge we can overcome, but insufficient political will is what's holding us back from universal internet access. Really interesting, and I'm looking forward to digging into that in the Q&A. So thank you very much. So great to know where you all stand. So in the spirit of keeping us on our toes on this hot afternoon, we're going to do a quick fire round now of all of our panelists and just understand in a minute or less from each of you, what do you see as the biggest barrier to universal internet access? What's the #1 thing standing in our way? And Traci, I'm going to turn to you first.
For Indian country, it's middle mile, access to middle mile. I mean, it's not going to be a matter of somebody dropping some satellites and connecting us. We do not have middle mile connections for our communities. And in a lot of cases, we don't have, the end as well, but we can build that. The problem is getting the fiber across the middle mile with such vast open spaces in our tribal lands.
Great, thank you. And now that we're on a tech and infrastructure, in a tech and infrastructure groove, Monica, over to you. What do you see as the biggest barrier?
Oh, sure. Well, at a global level, we're developing technologies and working with local partners across the globe to experiment with and build out connectivity solutions. And an important lesson from our experience so far really is that the prevailing regulatory framework can have a significant impact on whether, how, and how quickly we're able to deploy these types of projects and technologies. And so, we've learned that government striving to develop and initiate national broadband assessments and strategies and enacting policies that lower data costs for consumers, reduce the cost, policies that reduce the cost of infrastructure, and ensure access to high quality spectrum, as well as build out requirements that are timely and ensure sufficient coverage, and policies that foster competition. All of that has a huge impact on how quickly we're able to deploy.
Great, thank you, Monica. And thinking about the different regulatory frameworks that exist across the world, where better next than the UN Development Programme? Yolanda, what do you see as the #1 barrier?
Thanks, Sophie. I want to also at the global lens, but focus on the developing countries, where we see the biggest barrier is actually digital exclusion. So that means even when access or the internet connectivity is there, people may not be able to access or use it. So that means the digital divide is there. We all know it's urgent and important challenge, but it's not just infrastructure, as the report actually very clearly also articulated that. Therefore, we need to really think beyond just internet access from the infrastructure perspective or beyond the technology perspective, but towards a more digital inclusion. So which means that brings the access, affordability, capabilities, and how we use technology in a responsible way.
Great, thank you so much, Yolanda. That is very clear and a point that I hope we will pick up on in depth later in the panel. Mark, finally turning to you, what do you see as the biggest barrier?
I think if the ways we've used to connect people to the internet in the past actually worked, we wouldn't be here discussing this topic today. So, I believe that old policies need to be changed to support new approaches to connect more people. By changing policies on things like spectrum, universal service funding, and licensing to accommodate new connectivity solutions, we can truly start to bridge the digital divide.
Great, thank you very much. So very hopefully we've heard a multi-dimensional set of key barriers from each of our panelists, and I hope that we can build that out through the panel. We're now going to dive a bit more in depth into each of these. So I wanted to cling on to this structure that we've set up of 3 buckets, recognizing, as Yolanda has said, that it's flawed and that there are many more barriers to access than fit in those 3 buckets. So we have the economic bucket, the political bucket, and the technological bucket. And I want to unpack each of these with our panelists to see what are the key challenges and opportunities in each. And then we'll check this very simplified structure and explore some of the challenges and opportunities that lie outside those 3 buckets. What else do we need to address? And then we'll address some of the questions that we hope will be pouring into the chat function from the audience. So do keep those questions coming for the end. Mark, you have very bravely agreed to take on the economic case, which is potentially the most complicated part of the equation, or perhaps not. We've argued in this report that it's a no-brainer, and we've spelled out where we think the investment should come from. But regardless of the fact that it all works out on paper, $450 billion, especially now at this moment in human history, is a huge amount of money to mobilize. So from where you sit, who should finance universal internet access, and what gives you hope that such an investment is possible?
$450 billion is a lot of money, but the fact is that that money's already out there. We're just not harnessing it in the right ways. We need to make connectivity a top priority and open markets up to more complementary forms of access versus a model that enshrines private sector monopolies, something that has yet to deliver on the promise of universal internet access. Governments should be able to fund open or public networks, and a lot of that money can come from universal service funds. If universal service funds are open up to a variety of connectivity solutions, we could actually build networks everywhere we need to, however we can, be it through things like low Earth orbit satellites, fiber, community Wi-Fi projects, and so on. The technology doesn't really matter. It's really the will that matters. And I'm not saying that it is solely a government responsibility to fund network deployment. There's a lot of actors in the space, from philanthropic organizations to development agencies and local communities. We just need to ensure that we have a coordinated, targeted approach with a strong plan in place to ensure that we can connect everyone by 2030. But I think there's something wrong with the way that question's phrased, because I kind of think we really should be asking, what is the cost of not connecting the world? I know the report talks about a lot about investments in internet infrastructure and the resulting bump in GDP in the developing world. I think that creates such a compelling argument that we really need to look at.
Thank you. And that's such a good point, that the opportunity costs aren't clearly spelt out. And we talk about a growing digital divide, and we talk about, as more and more of our lives move online, the cost of being offline increases. But I think you're right that this is a case that we should make more clearly, and a case that we should make to political leaders. And with that in mind, I want to turn to Yolanda, who has the huge task of thinking about the incentive structure for leaders across the hundreds of countries in which UNDP works. Yolanda, we've argued in the report and in my brief introduction that the political case is clear, that universal internet access benefits everyone. The benefits are so clear-cut that, of course, this should be at the top of political agendas, but we still don't really see it rising to the top of the global policy agenda. And getting there is going to require significant and coordinated political commitment. From where you sit with this unique view across hundreds of countries, do you see the political will to make this happen out there? And if not, what do you see as the key blockers to having it at the top of political agendas, and perhaps the opportunities and the vehicles to get it there? So Yolanda, over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. This is a great question. And it's interesting to see from the survey earlier that people think lack of political will is actually the top one barrier. And there might be a little bit of discrepancy from our observation, maybe because we work mostly in developing countries. And just for those who may not be very familiar with UNDP, we work in 170 developing countries supporting their development agenda at the very overarching level. And what we observed last year, more or less accelerated by COVID, all the countries all of a sudden are waking up, realize, oh, digital is not just an add-on, digital is not just something we can play with, but internet activity is really the lifeline. We really need it. That's a must, right? So all of a sudden, all the countries, especially developed countries we serve, started really working on digital transformation. To give you some numbers, we just for our team, we requested, we received more than 30 requests from countries requesting for the development of their national digital strategy. And among them, of course, the universal access is always the very foundational layer. And to give you two very concrete examples, in Botswana and Sierra Leone, where I personally have working with, both of them have a digital strategy in place, very ambitious, and both of them already have indicated universal connectivity very clearly as the very starting point. So the short answer is, from our work experience, the political will is there in many countries. Of course, as a UN entity, we are not representing any governments, but these are really just our observations from our work with them. But my next point is, like, only having political will is not enough, and there is much more needed. So to give you two examples, or the blockers in the question using the language, the first one is really what we see so far is a very siloed and project-based approach towards connectivity, towards ICT, towards digital, right? A very classic example, you will see that mandated by the Ministry of ICT, while other ministries may or may not support. So in the case of Sierra Leone and Botswana that I just mentioned, the very interesting case is that both of them have set up a new unit at the very central and top level in their president's office or the PM's office to really lead that kind of a coordinated approach across all the different ministries. So that really provides the kind of opportunity for a very health government or even health society approach that UNDP has been really advocating for. And what does that actually mean? Mark, you mentioned that the universal access is not just government's responsibility. We really need to build a digital ecosystem at the local level and also at the international level. To give you another example, in Dominica, where we recently finished a digital readiness assessment, and we did a workshop to really validate the results and welcomed all the different stakeholders across the country. And they really gave lots of input on what they need, how the access can actually help them, what they would use this for. And this is where you start to really see the different perspectives. And that is really helpful for the country and for the government to really shape their strategy forward. And then, and of course, you need the digital capacity building for all the different stakeholders as well, especially in developing countries. And the other blocker, as I mentioned before, digital exclusion or digital inequality, is one of the major barriers that we saw. And that is when you think about digital or think about internet access without really considering the inclusion perspective. And that is where things might start going wrong, because if you start considering this too late, then, for example, let's think about a rural woman in Mauritania who, how can we make sure she would have access to internet and be able to utilize it for her benefits? Sometimes in a household, a woman may not even have the rights to use internet because she's not the house owner, for example. And that's where we need to really address accessibility, affordability, adoption, awareness of the risks and harms, for example. So digital and internet access really connects all the different challenges such as gender inequality, rural-urban divide, but this is a real opportunity for us to take the digital inclusion lens and then bring forward the whole society approach and work with everyone in the system and to really bring the benefits to all. Over.
Great, thank you so much. And I am very excited that 2 participants into this panel discussion, we've had one panelist saying the tech doesn't matter, political will is all that matters. And the next panelist saying, but political will isn't enough. So clearly we have a more complex problem on our hands here than we first thought. And with that in mind, with the tech doesn't matter, the tech's already there ringing in our ears, I want to turn to Monica. Now, we've argued in this report that the tech to connect the world, even those in remote and resource-constrained contexts, already exists. And we heard from Traci that if the regulatory environment is right, the tech will sort itself out. We've heard from Mark that the tech is much secondary to political will and regulation. And so I wanted to sense check that with you, sitting where you do. Are we right in our hypothesis that the tech is not the problem? And what do you see as the role of big tech players in connecting the world? Monica, over to you.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for this question. When I spoke in the rapid fire round earlier, I really focused on foundational low-tech actions to facilitate connecting the world, things like timely build-out requirements, preparing and executing on national broadband plans, enacting policies that lower data costs for consumers. So those types of government actions are extremely critical and they're foundational. But companies like Facebook also have an important role to play. And you're correct, technology exists and it's constantly getting better and it's constantly evolving to a lower cost. And we are working to help that happen. We found in our work, and I know everyone agrees, is that there's no one size fits all solution. And so we generally take an all of the above approach, supporting a myriad of internet access technologies and partners ranging from big mobile network operators to small niche internet service providers that need access to backhaul in rural areas because there is no fiber optic cable in close proximity to the proposed service location. So you have to consider the specific context of the problem that you're trying to solve, from geographic barriers and market conditions to the skills and the needs of the population at hand. So we believe that there's got to be a mixture of investments and policies in place. And the impact of our investments really depends on, the factors including the business models that are used, the available resources to help with adoption and integration, like digital skills, and the regulatory policies that are in place. So I can speak a little bit about the connectivity infrastructure and business models that we invest in. Our initiatives support economic growth by increasing internet use. And the economic and social gains from these initiatives stem from impacts on various stakeholders, individuals, enterprises, and government. So I'll just give you an example of the range of the types of technologies that we work with and the investments that we're doing. We're investing in and building shared terrestrial fiber backhaul and middle mile infrastructure that creates jobs and helps local network operators extend their networks, lower their costs and lower prices for consumers, and helps them upgrade their networks and improve quality of service. So for example, in the DRC, we're partnering with mobile operators to complete the country's first privately led long-haul fiber route, which helps to provide service across the western provinces and stabilize international connectivity. In Indonesia, we partnered with the wholesale provider to expand 3,000 kilometers of fiber optic connectivity, addressing the need for additional shared backhaul fiber. And this deployment will reach 20 cities from East Java and North Sulawesi and Bali, and support 4G coverage extension, bringing higher speed internet to over 10 million people. In the US, we're investing in infrastructure projects to connect data centers and to provide the needs of our services and users, and we're enabling local partners to purchase excess capacity on these lines. Our infrastructure tends to be located in areas of the country that lack the requisite capacity of long-haul fiber and with close proximity to our data centers, so that will serve our business needs. But then some of these areas lack fiber infrastructure altogether, and others lack the capacity to handle the volumes expected over the next few years. We're also expanding global network infrastructure, and our subsea projects leverage scale infrastructure and shared technology expertise. We've collaborated with partners all over the world to build several subsea fiber optic cables that lower costs for network operators and enable lower prices and improve network performance. We are making a significant investment into Africa, the subsea cable partnership, which will be one of the largest subsea cable projects in the world at 37,000 kilometers and connect close to 30 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And notably, it'll be the first cable system designed to serve the whole of Africa and will provide more capacity than all existing international cables serving the continent combined. And it's going to support the growth of faster and more affordable 4G, 5G, and fixed broadband access for hundreds of millions of people. So we're super excited about that. In rural areas, we're very focused on technologies that are now getting to this stage. We initially experimented with them, and now they're getting to the stage of scaling. Technologies such as Express Wi-Fi and Magma that make it more cost-effective for operators to deploy where coverage is scarce. In Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and other countries in the region, we're partnering with satellite operators, with ISPs and other local partners to accelerate deployment of community Wi-Fi hotspots through our Express Wi-Fi platform, which is a cloud-based software platform that allows internet service providers to manage, optimize, and grow their Wi-Fi networks and offer fast and affordable Wi-Fi in their communities in a sustainable manner. We estimate that more than 150,000 people are able to use these services on a monthly basis. For dense urban areas where it's difficult to run fiber to every household, we've built and now are deploying through service operator partners Terragraph, which is a wireless fiber performance-like technology with lightning-fast gigabit speeds, and it's attached to existing poles and other street furniture, so you don't have to dig up the ground underneath. Taken together, our internet connectivity investments have been significant. They've been estimated to generate more than $200 billion in economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Asian countries over the next 5 years, impacting over 100 million people across the globe. And that doesn't even include recently announced initiatives such as the To Africa subsea cable system that I mentioned. And I'll end by saying, as we're all aware, connectivity investments alone, as others have said, don't necessarily result in the catalytic development outcomes that we'd like to see. Adoption and integration are also necessary to ensure sustainable development outcomes. Education levels play a crucial role in the adoption and utilization of the internet. And we want to make sure that local communities where we invest, including vulnerable populations, are provided with digital skills to fully utilize the internet. So we are investing in programs and initiatives like a digital literacy library, which provides resources for educators, programs that are targeting women entrepreneurs. We have programs that target skills and training for small businesses and others. And it's those as well that will make a difference in deployment, programs like that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Monica. And I think you've set us up perfectly for our fourth and final question for this first round, which is, we wrote this report largely from the perspective of lower and middle income countries. And we've heard you talk about the investments that tech companies are making in connecting the Western Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. And yet here we are, I'm not, the rest of you I think are sitting in the richest country in the world, and we're still facing issues of limited connectivity. So if we've set out that the investment case is clear, that this is rising up political agendas, that there's a strong role to play for tech companies and the private sector in connecting the world. Turning to you, Traci, how are we still then in a situation where large populations in the richest country on earth are missing out on connectivity and internet access? And what are the factors, and Yolanda's already got us started here, but what are the factors that fall outside those three buckets we mentioned that are still getting in the way of connecting the world? Traci, over to you.
Chukma Yakoke, thank you. As I'm listening to everybody, there's so many things I wanted to respond to. So I think that I'm going to frame it in terms of the fourth bucket. If we're talking about economic development, tech, and political, all those things are super important. But maybe the fourth bucket should be called one size does not fit all, because we're so different. We're all so different. And I can't speak to some of the other countries and such, but I can speak to Indian country. And let me give a brief overview, then I'm going to talk about some of the things that we're working towards. So Indian country is a term that we use to describe, well, it's actually a legal term, but it's also a philosophical term for home. But it's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States on 334 reservations in 35 states with over 100 million acres of land. It's largely rural, but yet we're only 2% of the population, and we're really young, about 10% younger than the rest of the American population. So there's a lot of native digital natives, but that are really disconnected and such. The other thing that makes us different in the US is that we're part of the family of governments. We have a treaty obligation, or the United States has a treaty obligation through the federal trust responsibility to work with tribes on certain issues. So we, at the Policy Institute and with our colleagues at the National Congress of American Indians and other tribal organizations and on behalf of tribes, we work to create a collective voice that the National Congress of American Indians can use then to work with the United States in legislation and policy development in reminding them of their treaty obligations and such. So it is in policy, it's the policies are starting to be in place. Sometimes they're getting better right now. In economics, I think of the private sector investments. They so don't work in Indian country. But let me tell you what we're doing right now. So we've been working with National Congress of American Indians and some of our colleagues in creating some background research and work. We're working on some mapping work. Mark knows about this because there's no maps that are accurate. And I've been working on that for 15 years myself. But right now we have an opportunity. So it's not to talk about what we don't have. What we need to talk about is how we can be a part of what's happening now. And we have huge things happening now with the jobs bill, which should be called an infrastructure bill. And so right now we've been working to produce the documentary research.
Recording in progress.
Hello?
Hello?
Okay. And I'm echoing. Somebody got their microphone on?
I'm so sorry about that. It looks like we've sorted the problem. Please continue and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again.
So that's no problem. So like I said, we've been putting together documentation of what research does exist, what documents do exist, tribal testimony, tribal leader testimony to inform making sure that we get included in this new bill. So there's several things. That's why I said there's several things that have come up as primary themes right now in this moment of opportunity. One of them was the opportunity that I said, it is about middle mile. That is really what we need. But we also need to create some priorities in funding because as Mark said, community-driven solutions work. We know our communities, but because of the way our communities are so rural and rugged, competition models don't often work without some regulatory incentive, as they say, because there's no bang for the buck when you can serve one household or 4 versus 500 over here. So we are, there's a need for some direct funding, direct tribal funding, because we do know our communities in these acts. There is need for feasibility studies and mapping studies. There's need for, I'm going through a list, there's so much regulatory. We need, and getting things to happen. We have rights of way issues in our tribal lands because our land is, we don't own our land. And that's something that folks may not know. Tribal communities don't own our land. It is managed in perpetuity by the federal government as part of the treaty status. So we can operate on it, but we can't collateralize it. We cannot, we don't approve end user, things like rights of way for installing fiber. So there has to be some programs to work through that quickly, because we can't do a shovel-ready project in past legislation. Those kinds of things couldn't go through. It could take 2 years to get an approval through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So we're working for a tribal broadband rights of way program that will streamline those processes, and interoperability between all of the agencies. I don't think any of y'all would argue against that in any country, because if they aren't talking to each other, how can they serve communities? And we're just advocating also for the targeting of middle mile fiber. So the reality is there's a lot, and then of course digital inclusion. I can't leave that out, but we're actually advocating for specific monies for specific programs for tribal communities as part of our treaty status. So I do believe that some of that's going to get included in new infrastructure bills. But the reality is none of this has really changed over the last 10 to 12 years, what we're advocating for. What has happened is it's become more concrete. There are better policies. People are starting to understand, because there's starting to be a small cadre of folks who know this. We definitely need to grow our human capital as well. We've been working on, there's lots of little solutions. It's creating a comprehensive solution to the human capital we need to be able to do this, the knowledge base, educating our partners and folks that are like-minded, organizations that are like-minded. There's a lot of work to be done, and you got to remember, we're 2% of the population. And of that 2%, the folks that could probably talk about that is more like about 0.1%, maybe, if they've studied it. So, or if they've worked around it, or if their community has been in the advanced stages of it versus the ones that are coming now. So we have a lot of work, but we have a tremendous opportunity. I think I can echo everything everybody has said. It is the economic development. It's the tech, and the tech is there. There are people interested. The political is definitely a part of it, but I could never have ranked them. Thank goodness you didn't let us vote in it, the panelists, and I couldn't have ranked it, because I think it's all of them. I think communities can drive that. And I don't think that's just in tribal communities. I think that's in disconnected urban communities. I would venture to bet it's in a lot more places than we realize if we listen. The only thing that tribes have is we have that federal relationship in the United States that allows us to push that further into specific non-race-based policies and legislation. That's the only thing that makes it different. We have so many commonalities. So I think I'll leave it at there and see what comes up with our questions, because I hope that I've summarized it, because I think what everybody said was spot on and impacts tribes. And I just added a few little things.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And it is so interesting going from the global perspective to the US perspective and hearing about some of the issues you've been working on. And I think with that in mind, we've had a brilliant question that's come through in the chat that I wanted to put first to Yolanda from the international perspective, and then to Mark from the US perspective. And then Traci, let us know if there are bits that you wanted to jump in with after Mark's had a go at this, because I think it's a critical question, and it's something that the report authors I know really wrestled with, which is, in this pandemic year and a half, or 2 years, however long it's been now, where we've seen communities torn apart, and we've seen real fundamental frailty in health systems and in food systems and in many of the aspects, many of the basic needs that we all count on from day to day. Is it right at this moment in time to be advocating for funding in recovery packages to be channeled to universal internet access. In some ways, this feels like a tricky moment to be making that case with 5 to 7 countries on the brink of famine and health systems in disarray across the world. So Yolanda, maybe if you could give that a go from the international perspective, and then Mark, we turn to you for a US slant on the issue. So Yolanda, over to you.
Sure, thank you, Sophie, and thank you for the great question as well. And so I think we need to look at the question in 2 different phases. One is when we talk about immediate, when a crisis such as COVID hit, right? Of course, when countries in their immediate response phase, it's very hard for them to say we're going to invest billions into connectivity while there's hundreds of other urgent fires to put off. So for that, what we did is when COVID hit, there are a lot of countries, governments actually struggle with providing the really basic service, as the question also posed. So what we did is actually provide them with the very basic devices that can help them boost their connectivity a little bit. So at least the government can continue to provide the e-service, which they couldn't provide otherwise. But now that many countries have started to really recovering and getting out of COVID and thinking about what do they do next. And it's the recovery phase as we define it. And that's when they need to really think about not only how to recover from this crisis, but also how to prepare themselves for the next crisis, whatever that crisis might be, right? So that is when the next phase where this kind of argument, this kind of investment would be really needed. And the way to tackle that is, again, to connect this with all the other challenges. It's not we say digital is more important than water, or digital is more important than electricity. Of course, these basic needs need to be fulfilled, but digital will, or internet connectivity will become the foundational layer to achieve all the other benefits, to achieve all the other services or all the other quality life that we aim for. So that would be the argument. And so that has to be packaged in a holistic way rather than a standalone. We need such investment for connectivity only. Over.
Thanks, Yolanda. Yes, I'd absolutely agree with that. So Mark, how does that look from the US angle?
Yeah, Yolanda's response was excellent, right? To me, it's not an either or question. As I said before, the money's out there. We're just not using it in the right way, or we're not accessing what's out there to do this work. But as Yolanda said, you know, I believe the internet is an enabler of all of the SDGs, right? To achieve the SDGs, I think the internet cuts across all of them. So investments in internet access is an investment in healthcare. It's an investment in economic development. It's an investment in education. I think we need to think it through that way, as opposed to looking at it as an either or. We also saw the tremendous role the internet played during the pandemic in keeping people healthy and ensuring that, if possible, people could work at home, kids could study at home, to avoid spreading the virus even further. You know, in a way, it's a strong public health measure. And as Yolanda said, this is a way to prepare for the next crisis, whatever it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. Traci, I know that you also had some thoughts on this question. Please, over to you.
I absolutely do. You know, we have the lowest adoption, the lowest connectivity in the United States, tribes do. It's estimated that about 45% of the population has actually adopted, with only about 67% even having access to, and most of those aren't wired. Look, people died in Indian country, and it's because of the lack of internet. I'll say that. And over the course of this year, of course, we have a new president, and his administration has conducted hundreds of listening sessions with tribal leaders. And overarchingly, what we heard in these tribal leader listening sessions was broadband. We need broadband. We can't even get the word out about what's happening in healthcare. We can't do telehealth to save lives. We can't broadcast what you shouldn't. Early on, it was what you should and shouldn't do, how long you should wash your hands and all that. Let alone the folks who just dropped out of education, because I mean, we saw students from our university leave, we saw kids in the reservations. It was astounding how it was devastating to watch how the lack of internet impacted Indian country from a firsthand basis is what I will say. So I think it's very easy. It's been very easy in Indian country to make the case that prioritizing universal digital access during COVID was absolutely primary and should be in recovery packages.
Thank you. That is an incredibly powerful way to round out the answer to that complex question. And I think we've heard loud and clear that it's not a stark choice between internet and other basic needs. Internet underpins a lot of those basic needs and rights and freedoms. So thank you. That's really clear. Robert had a great question in the chat, which I wanted to expand upon a little bit from what I've heard today. I think, Monica, I'm gonna pick on you for this one, if this is okay. So we've heard, in your opening said, the biggest challenge that you faced is national regulation. And then I think Yolanda and Traci have both built on that a little bit to say it's regulation and ensuring that all the demand side issues around digital literacy, around tailoring the internet to be locally content relevant, around addressing all of the cultural and social factors that might keep people offline. That's a challenging policy and regulatory package to deal with. And I wonder, from your perspective, as you work across hundreds of different countries and you see the ways that lots of different governments approach this, where does the push need to come from to address, on one side, the regulatory environment, and on the other side, the social, cultural, developmental interventions that address the softer barriers to getting people online? Who needs to be the first mover there?
I mean, I think we all need to be movers there. You know, it's true that the growth and my point, I think that I was trying to make at the beginning, is that the growth and the vibrancy of the global internet really depends on an enabling regulatory and policy making environment. And it's the structure that will determine the impact of the investment, you know, to development outcomes. But at the same time, we're all responsible for making sure that you know, there's digital literacy, there are digital literacy programs, and making sure that issues like security, community engagement, safety and well-being, you know, those are all emphasized. People need to understand what they're looking at, understand how to be safe on the internet. We have a digital literacy library, as I mentioned, with resources for educators. We also have our digital literacy programs we do alongside many of our mobile network operator partners. So we're working in partnership with a number of entities to help support digital literacy.
Great, thank you. And I think the point that Robert was making in the question, which unfortunately we don't have time to do a full round on this, but I would love to, is to understand what role both the private sector and nonprofits can play in influencing this sort of policy. And that's, if we had another half an hour, that's what I would love to dig into, because unfortunately we don't have another half an hour. And I know, Monica, you have a hard stop right now. What I am going to do is ask for another quick fire round of panelists. Monica, starting with you, and then I know you have to leave us, and to also ask our audience to write their ideas in the chat. I'm going to ask each of you what you see as the one critical next step that is manageable within the next year. So before the end of 2022, what should we be prioritizing above all else to get the world online by 2030? So Monica, you have the mic. Over to you.
Sure. I think striving to drive the availability, affordability, and adoption of the internet by the various methods that I had mentioned before.
Great, thank you. And if you have to drop and we don't get a chance, thank you so much for joining. It's been fantastic. You've made a huge contribution, so thank you very much.
Thank you all as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So Traci, turning to you next, one critical step within the next year.
This is such a hard question. Critical step, I think in terms of concrete, I'm never a fluffy, that's not fluffy, but I always think of what it's actually doable. And I think what's doable is we need to talk more and we need to find commonalities so that we can work together as opposed to in silos in any of the different buckets that we talked about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And it seems to be a common theme that's coming out throughout this panel. Yolanda, what about you? One critical next step before the end of 2022?
I think it's the continue to push for national digital transformation, which has the inclusive connectivity or meaningful connectivity at its core.
Brilliant, thank you. And last but not least, Mark, what should we be focusing on for the next year?
Well, the one thing I've heard, well, my big takeaway from this discussion today is that it's so much more than just a problem that governments can fix or that the private sector can fix. And it's not just about, you know, the binary, do you have access to a Wi-Fi signal or do you not have access to a Wi-Fi signal? So that's going to take a lot of hands. That's going to take a lot of diverse hands. So we need to figure out how to get the right people at the table and get the right people to the table who can do the work and ensure that it sounds so easy. We need partnerships. Partnerships look great on paper, but the challenge in building internet networks is the human network that you need to build first. And I think that's where we need to focus our energies.
Mark, I could not agree more. It's as if you've stolen my scribbled notes out from under my nose, because I think that is absolutely where this panel is ending up. And it's not honestly where I expected to be landing today. But I think that the 2 points I'm really taking away from this are, Mark, where you started us off in thinking through more carefully the costs of inaction and having that be the driver of everything that we do. So what does the world look like in 5 years if the digital divide keeps growing? What does it look like for marginalized communities in the US, marginalized communities in Botswana and Sierra Leone? And what does it look like for geographic inequality between countries? And I think having that as a driver will catalyze us into getting all of the different pieces of the puzzle into perspective. And then the second point is the point you've made about this being, there's so much, the case is clear, there's so much good work going on this in different silos that aren't connecting and aren't talking to each other. And I would love to see us better connect the efforts that are going on in the private sector, the efforts that Monica's been talking about, with some of the efforts that Yolanda and Traci have been talking about public policy in countries across the world. Plus working with governments and supporting governments as they try and build out some of these initiatives, and to try and build a community in which the work that Traci is doing in influencing policy to include the most marginalized in the US is feeding into the work that Yolanda is doing in Botswana and Sierra Leone to ensure that the most marginalized people in those countries are included in national policy. And I'm coming to this role and this discussion from the humanitarian sector, from emergency response, where we would always wring our hands and say that coordination could be so much better and that we should all be talking to each other more. But I think stepping into this world, what I'm seeing increasingly is that great work is happening in pockets across the world, and we need to do a much better job, exactly as you say, of getting the right people around the table, learning from each other and pulling together the different pieces of the puzzle that will enable us to achieve universal internet access by 2030. And before closing and thanking our panelists, I just want to reflect, Traci, what you said, which is that this, and as you said so eloquently, which is that this isn't an abstract technical puzzle that we're working on paper. This isn't a nice to have. This isn't something that can be added on to national development plans. Exclusion from connectivity is killing people and has killed people and needs to be prioritized by leaders across the world. And that needs to be a more active coalition across sectors and across the great work that we've seen represented on this panel today. So thank you all so much. I feel like we've taken a complex problem and added even more facets of complexity, but I appreciate the fact that all the speakers, all the panelists are landing on this call for greater coordination, this call for greater learning across across different sectors. So I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to share your work and share your ideas with us today. I have learned a huge amount. Liz and I and my other colleagues from TBI will go away, distill down what we've learned today and share some notes back with you all. So thank you so much for taking the time, and to everyone in our audience who's taken an hour out of your day to join us, to share your great questions with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. If you are interested in what you've heard today, please do share the recording with colleagues that weren't able to join. So I'm going to bring this to a close with huge thanks from me, and we'll be back with you with notes from today's discussion very shortly. Thanks so much.